This is your brain on risk. This is Mind Over Money, the podcast where Kevin Cook exposes the psychology of investing.
Welcome back to Mind Over Money. I'm Kevin Cook, your field guide and storyteller for the fascinating arena of behavioral economics. This is going to be at least a 3-part series because the topic is so big and there's so many threads to weave together here that I think are just fascinating. Right now, I'm going to run through a menu of some of the topics we're going to cover in this series that I'm calling Fast Times at Innovation High. So my theme is success as corporations pull it off. As in my role here, studying companies and advising people which stocks to buy, I study a lot of companies, and hopefully I would learn something about success or not. And, we talk about execution. Every quarter, companies give their quarterly report cards, and we want to see, did they execute? Did they do what they said they were going to do? Did they follow their strategic plan? Did they grow profits and revenues? Did they expand as they said they were going to? So there's all kinds of things that can fall under execution for companies, and we want to know, did they pull it off or not? And there's plenty of companies that don't. There's a ton that do, and we want to study both of them, I think. As a student of behavioral finance and economics and decision making, there's so much to be learned from companies that do it well. And if you think about it, it's not just that, well, they've got all this capital, that doesn't necessarily predict success. Companies can have all the money in the world and still fail. We've seen plenty of examples of that. I was thinking yesterday as I prepared for this series about 2 companies in particular, Lululemon and Under Armour, both in the same type of business, and one doing extremely well after a few issues, and that's Lululemon. And Under Armour, since its last earnings report, just this year, the stock has gone from 19 to 13, and their last earnings report was February 11th. Shares dropped from, I believe, 18 to 15, and now are just lower this week as the market takes a break. But I want to do a compare-contrast on what's happened there with strategy and execution and leadership. So when you try and model success in your personal life, and by the way, as I came up with the idea for this series last week, and it's, how when you set an idea or an intention or an interest, all of a sudden you notice all these things that you can use. Everything starts coming in under your radar and in your microscope that you can use for this topic. And I just have a list that's so long here of things that I've come across. I'll share. Some of them are pretty exciting. But when I think about success modeling, in your individual life, so let's say people say, oh, I read Tony Robbins' books, and I follow his method of goal setting or achievement, or somebody else like him. You can do that. You could also just study corporations. You could study, how has Jeff Bezos pulled off what he's pulled off with Amazon, or Elon Musk with Tesla, or Richard Branson in all his enterprises. And we can, these are sort of the new philosopher kings, I call them. We can go back a few decades and find similar good advice. I think of Andy Grove at Intel, and what was the name of his book? Only the Paranoid Survive. So, and we're actually going to come back to that. So thinking about, I've studied this from the aspect of trading, because in short-term trading, where, you're trading either futures or stocks, and you're in your day trading, you plan to just capture some quick profits inside of a few hours or a few minutes and go home flat that night, just taking that piece out of the market or a stock. That environment, that high-speed environment is great for learning about human behavior and biases and blind spots because it exposes weaknesses in decision making very quickly. So, fast decision making just reveals your biases, your blind spots, and what I would call emotional fault lines, and also just general fallacies. If somebody's bad with probability or how their process for making decisions, that will become quickly apparent. So for companies, what I was trying to make a list of what are the big things that you want to focus on? Like, what are companies responsible for? And I made a list of 8 things that I think, why companies get more done as opposed to you and I in our personal lives. If we say we have long-term goals, but if you check in with us every quarter, we may have left behind the New Year's resolutions not too long ago. Whereas a corporation can't afford to do that because they're extremely accountable to Wall Street, to investors, to shareholders. So they better be doing something on their strategic plan. All right, so let me run through the menu here of different things we're going to talk about. I want to talk about Ron Barron, a big Tesla investor, and the interview I saw with him recently where he explained why Detroit auto companies, incumbents, are going to eventually have some big issues on their hands with the rise of electric vehicles. And it's a very interesting look at when you are an incumbent with a certain technology and how a disruptive new technology can totally change your industry and either force you to change your business model or not. You see how long you can hold out without changing it. We're going to talk about Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, because I talk about it all the time. I think it's just an excellent book with his big picture view of big history, tying together so many concepts and patterns. He was just profiled in The New Yorker this month by Ian Parker, published on February 10th. I just read it I read it last week. It's titled Yuval Noah Harari's History of Everyone, Ever. Which, is kind of a tongue-in-cheek description of his book, which I just said was big history and the big patterns of human civilization. So that's a fun way of talking about it. And Ian asks, the sort of summary tease is, his blockbuster Sapiens predicted the possible end of humankind. Now what? So this is one of those profiles that's, intimate. You get to meet his spouse and learn about his personal life. And, obviously the journalist went to Israel and spent some time with them and then interviewed other people. So I have some thoughts on that. We'll get to that. We'll talk about Facebook a little bit. We'll talk about other experts on innovation like Catherine Wood at ARK Invest. And, I'll introduce a lot of other things too. Like at some point I might pull up I Googled something. What did I Google for this? Best companies or, most successful companies or most admired companies, I think. And so I came up with lists like that. Fortune has a great running list of most admired companies that I think are, they do some kind of poll of 1,000 or 2,000 business leaders every year. And, typical names come up: Starbucks, Apple, probably Lululemon's in the top 50. We'll look at that. So let me run through this list I made of why corporations work to achieve goals. So I started writing down things and then I ranked them. And here was the ranking I came up with. And it gets harder because some things you're like, well, it seemed like this would be a tie. But so I'm ranking these 8 things in terms of what you absolutely must have for a company to succeed. And number 1 would be capital and resources. You've got to have something to start with, right? Number 2 would be, where did I put number 2? Structure and routine. You have to have, a business process that, when people show up to work, they know exactly. There's facilities. You're taking those capital and resources and turning them into a business, whether it's a factory floor, or if it's a newspaper, you've got, or a magazine, you've got, people have access to the internet and materials that they can conduct interviews and research and that sort of thing. Number 3, systems and processes. So this drills down more deeper into structure and routine, that the business itself has to have rules for operating that get carried out day after day. And that's everything from, making the product, shipping it, billing, accounts receivable, payroll, that kind of thing, to keep the lights on. Number 4 would be focus and priorities. Now, you could have all those other things, but if you're not focused on your priorities and you're trying to do too much, that's a recipe for failure in business. And hopefully we'll look at some examples of that. Number 5, rewards. The people aren't going to show up unless they're getting paid. So there's got to be, a system of rewards where people can count on some kind of certainty that they're going to get paid. And, so that's payroll, benefits, probably that you have a structure for cash flow so that your suppliers are getting paid too. Number 6, I'm looking up and down the list because I just made this list and then I went back and reordered it. Accountability. So accountability is what I put. Well, employees are accountable to their boss. Employees are accountable to each other. And then the business as a whole is accountable to customers. So, you can't go around pissing off your customers every day and stay in business. Number 7, strategic planning and execution. Look at that, how when I was forced to rank these things that I listed, strategy and execution came so low on the list because, a business with capital and some kind of priorities and systems can make a product and ship it, market it, sell it, deliver it, and maybe not have a good strategy or maybe not do regular strategic planning. So their execution is just the daily grind and they don't have a longer term plan for how to improve, how to adapt to competition, changing conditions, that kind of thing. So that was kind of interesting how that worked out in my ranking. And then number 8, I put teams. So where, when you think of ideal workplaces, it's people who enjoy their jobs, enjoy working with their coworkers, and feel like they're making a contribution on a team, with some kind of autonomy and entrepreneurial spirit. So that sort of higher level accountability to your teammates creates another form of motivation. Oh, I want to remember I said I bring in, or when you have a new idea, you attract all sorts of things that could help in that fleshing out that idea. And over the weekend, I was at the library and I came across a used book sale, and I found a book that has just been a lot of fun for the past few days. And it's about a Texas oil family called the Murchisons. Now, if you know anything about Texas or oil or the Dallas Cowboys, then you know who the Murchisons are, Murchissons. The book by Jane Wolfe, the subtitle, The Rise and Fall of a Texas Dynasty. And the Houston Post called it a grand tale of trial and triumph in Texas. And so, this is, if you know anything about 1980s television, this is the Ewings, that TV show Dallas. I mean, this is really, this real life family was the inspiration for everything that's big and oil and rich in Texas. And they started the Dallas Cowboys in the 60s. So, I mean, this thing has everything. In addition, this was not a family of angels necessarily. So it's full of, the book is full of their stories of scandal and whatnot. And it opens, the book opens in 1985 when Clint Murchison Jr., the son of one of the sons of the patriarch who created their oil fortune, had just sold the Dallas Cowboys for $80 million in 1984. And then in February of 1985, he's having a meeting at his house, and it's all his creditors who want their money. And he's just deep in debt. And he's also ill. He had some degenerative nerve condition. But so where did they get their money other than just oil? Their father, Clint Sr., was a wheeler dealer in oil leases, and he used a lot of leverage. So, to him, his math was 1 + 1 = 11. And that can give you an idea of the leverage that he used to build up their fortune. It's estimated at one point the Murchisons were worth nearly $500 million. By the time the creditors were in Clint Jr.'s home in 1985 trying to get some money, they probably owed $500 million and were not liquid at all. With the properties that they owned, everything from real estate to art, a great art collection. So this is a great tale of strategy and maybe some bad execution and decision making. Let me read the close of chapter 1 because this is very insightful in terms of behavioral economics. It was like a death in the family, said Clint Jr.'s daughter-in-law, Judy Murchison, unable to control her tears. You wondered and you asked yourself, how did we ever fall so far from where we were? How could this ever have happened? And that's typical. People, they think that things are going to remain the same, and especially if you're rich and successful. So here's a good example of not understanding leverage and how when your wealth and your fortune and your business are built on leverage, then things can collapse pretty fast. So shoot me email or comments if you know more about the Murchison story that I should share as I work my way through it. All right, let's go to Sapiens because Harari does a great job of setting the table, so to speak, for talking about modern business and capitalism and the rise of capitalism. His chapter 16, about 300 pages into the book, is titled The Capitalist Creed. And, he's already gone through how money and trade and empires created the world up until, say, 1500. But then there was this flurry of, new expansion with sailing around the world and building empires and what money had to do with that. So in this chapter, he actually has a few diagrams where he's trying to sort of explain what an entrepreneur is faced with in terms of getting capital and expanding their business. He's got a drawing here of 5 circles in a circle, which he calls the magic circle of the modern economy. And I suppose you could start, let's start with credit. From credit, we have the ability to pay contractors or buy supplies. And he's using an example of somebody starting a bakery. How could you grow a bakery and have several of them? You're able to start new bakeries, you bake cakes and sell cakes that pay back loans, and then you have a trust in the future. Now, so the reason I bring this up is because the important concept he tries to get across is that the idea of credit was a relatively new concept during the Renaissance because in it, you had to have some sort of faith in the future, right? Why would you lend somebody money unless you thought that things were going to be different in the future and that they would grow their business beyond simple cash flow and then be able to pay you back. So this was an emerging concept and practice. And obviously, credit fuels growth. He has another little diagram here. The pre-modern economy had little credit, slow growth, and little trust in the future. And those three things sort of cycle downward or stagnate with no growth. And the modern economy is based on lots of credit, fast growth, lots of trust in the future, and that's sort of the virtuous cycle of economic, the capitalist system. All right, I want to move forward to a fantastic example that you may not know of some capitalists who really created a model for many modern businesses or successful enterprises since the Renaissance, really. And that is the Dutch and their model of seafaring, expansion, exploration, and how they used credit to do it. So he sets this up by talking about Spain versus the Dutch. The Spanish were sort of the overlords with the best navy and armies and access to capital, that kind of thing. So let me just read a little bit from this. In 1568, the Dutch, who were mainly Protestant, revolted against their Catholic Spanish overlord. At first, the rebels seemed to play the role of Don Quixote, courageously tilting at invincible windmills. Yet within 80 years, the Dutch had not only secured their independence from Spain, but had managed to replace the Spaniards and their Portuguese allies as masters of the ocean highways, and to build a global Dutch empire and become the richest state in Europe. So how exactly did they do this? The Spaniards with their allies, the Portuguese, basically rule the oceans and have some capital control over the Dutch. And from 1568, within 80 years, the Dutch reversed that. Harari goes on here. The secret of Dutch success was credit. The Dutch burghers, who had little taste for combat on land, hired mercenary armies to fight the Spanish for them. The Dutch themselves, meanwhile, took to the sea in ever larger fleets. Mercenary armies and cannon-brandishing fleets cost a fortune, but the Dutch were able to finance their military expeditions more easily than the mighty Spanish Empire because they secured the trust of the burgeoning European financial system at a time when the Spanish king was carelessly eroding its trust in him. Financiers extended the Dutch enough credit to set up armies and fleets, and these armies and fleets gave the Dutch control of the world trade routes, which in turn yielded handsome profits. The profits allowed the Dutch to repay the loans, which strengthened the trust of the financiers. Amsterdam was fast becoming not only one of the most important ports of Europe, but also the continent's financial mecca. And then he goes on, in detail to answer the question, how exactly did the Dutch win the trust of the financial system? And I'll leave it there and encourage you to read Harari's book if you haven't yet. Which brings up, many people are critical of this book. And I think part of it is because it's so famous. I mean, it's been made famous. You have Bill Gates, Barack Obama, and somebody else famous saying, oh, this is, you got to read Sapiens, great book, love it. Okay, well, that doesn't mean just because something's popular that it's not worth your time. So some people will say, well, it's overrated. Sapiens is overrated, because they don't want to read a book just because Bill Gates or Barack Obama told them to. Read it because I told you to, but there's a lot of important ideas. And I think what Harari does that few others have done, and I would say among the few would be Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel, is take this big picture view of human evolution and the evolution of civilization and find what are the patterns that tended to repeat, or what are the changes, disruptions, and innovations that took a given society in a different direction. If you haven't read Guns, Germs, and Steel, maybe start there, and if you like it, you'll want to go on to Sapiens. But the main idea that Diamond gets across in Guns, Germs, and Steel was that the reason that Europeans ended up with those three things, and say, the heart of Africa did not, was because of the geographic dispersion of populations in Europe, both laterally and longitudinally. So they were encountering a variety of climate and then a variety of other cultures. And so the variation in climate forces adaptations like clothing and mastery of fire, and shelter, and probably weapons for hunting in the winter. So a harsh climate, especially a cold one, forces a lot of innovation or death. And then traveling east to west and encountering many different cultures was key to some of the development. I mean, the Chinese basically had invented everything first. Not everything, but they were significant inventors and technologists, while Europe was still, barely coming out of the plague, the Black Death. And so for Europeans to get access to any of the ideas and technology out of China was key for our development of guns and steel. And obviously germs. The idea there for Diamond is that Europeans could easily go into a new land and expose the indigenous population to whatever they were carrying, and basically wipe them out that way, intentionally or otherwise. All right, so, and you can skip the New Yorker review of Harari unless you want to know about him personally, what his life is like, and I've heard some people call it a scathing interview because it exposes things about him. That's neither here nor there. And the interview kind of ends on a weak note anyway. It spends like the last 3 paragraphs talking about some random person that encountered Harari once and what she thought of him. So that's that. All right. What's our next topic today? I think of, so I mentioned Only the Paranoid Survive. That was Andy Grove of Intel. 2 other books I want to mention from the 80s that dealt with high-speed change. At the time, either of these 2 people could have written a book called Fast Times at Innovation High, and that would be Tom Peters, who his first book was In Search of Excellence, and I forgot his partner's name, and then he did things like Thriving on Chaos, where he saw rapid change happening in the 80s and how corporations were adapting. And then another favorite business author of mine from the 80s is Rosabeth Moss Kanter. And she wrote a book called The Change Masters. Similar theme. I think she was at Harvard, and she's writing about how corporations dealt with, disruption, innovation, and rapid change. And, what's funny is, like, they must look at the world now going, I mean, companies thought they had it tough in 1985. Look what's going on now. It would be great to, I follow Tom Peters on Twitter, and I would love to hear what Rosabeth Moss Kanter says now about the pace of change and disruption. So I want to share something. I want to share another book, our 3rd book today, after The Murchisons and Sapiens, and that is, the title of it is Decisive: How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work, by 2 brothers, Chip Heath and Dan Heath. I think one of them, let's see where they are. One of them's at Stanford Graduate School of Business, and the other is a senior fellow at Duke University Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship. And they had a couple of other books before Decisive that were pretty popular, kind of put them on the map, and that was Switch and Made to Stick. Now, this book, Decisive, I just reread the first chapter last night, and it's really good because they're coming at this. The topic for my podcast here is, how do companies succeed based on their strategy and execution and decision making, and how do they fail when those things let them down? And they open with Andy Grove of Intel and the big choice that he faced. If I find it, I'll read from it, but I'll just sum it up. I'm pretty sure this was like mid 80s. Intel was very successful with memory chips, and that was their primary product, was making memory chips. But they were starting to lose business because everybody was making memory chips, and they knew this was a problem. They knew they had to make a decision about what to do next and how to adapt, but they took their time. And I guess by the middle 80s, Japan was really clobbering the market. They were opening factories and making the whole menu of memory chips, and their market share went over 50%. So really threatening Intel's business model. And let me find a few good paragraphs of this. Yeah, so this was 1985, and Andy Grove is writing about this in his book, Only the Paranoid Survive. Which is such a great title, right? It's like it really is the motto of how companies stay alive and adapt in this age of rapid disruption and innovation. The things we've been talking about here in several episodes of this podcast. So between 1978 and 1988, the market share held by Japanese companies in the memory space doubled from 30% to 60%. So in that 10-year period, the Japanese were just ramping up production and stealing share from Intel. Now here's where Intel had sort of a window of opportunity. A small team at Intel had developed another product, the microprocessor. And in 1981, the team got a big break when IBM chose Intel's microprocessor to be the brain of its new personal computer. Intel's team scrambled to build the manufacturing capacity it would need to produce the chips. But while they're losing market share in their primary business, which was memory chips, they were having all these internal debates about what do we do next, and there were variations like, oh, well, let's get out of the memory business and just focus on this new business. And that was on one end of the extreme, and it was a very unpopular idea, especially among salespeople and anybody else relying on the revenue streams they had from memory chips. But, things were starting to heat up. There were stories, and Grove says, people who came back from visits to Japan told scary stories. And that was about the Japanese building up their capacity and taking so much market share. Meanwhile, the microprocessor business was growing rapidly, but Intel's failures in memory were becoming a drag on its profits. Grove summarized the year 1984 by saying, "It was a grim and frustrating year. During that time, we worked hard without a clear notion of how things were ever going to get better. We had lost our bearings." Okay, this sounds like a strategy problem there, and not being able to know what to do next. But where the authors are going, why Chip and Dan Heath are telling this story, is because what eventually led Andy Grove to get out of the memory business was a process of thinking where he sort of had an epiphany, but it wasn't. But it relied on him as the leader to have the epiphany, whereas if they had a better process internally for making the decision among the management team and the board, if they had a more open source decision-making process with lots of input, they might have come to it sooner. Andy Grove's epiphany, I guess, was he was sitting around with one of the other founders of Intel, which would have been Gordon Moore. And I believe Gordon Moore is the Moore of Moore's Law about chips shrinking in size by half and doubling in computing power every 18 months, which held true for probably 30, 40 years. They were sitting, having a discussion, and Andy looked out the window, and I think he said he looked at a Ferris wheel or something, and all of a sudden it dawned on him that he turned back to Gordon and asked, if we got kicked out of the board and brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do? And Gordon answered without hesitation, he would get us out of memories, meaning making memory chips. And Andy says he stared at Gordon numb. And then he said, why shouldn't you and I walk out the door, come back in, and do it ourselves? So he was hypothetically thinking, if you had a fresh start, if you weren't there anymore and you were an outsider, what would you do with Intel? And so his insight was clearly get out of the memory business and throw everything into the microprocessor business. Now, so they had to make that decision, through their own thinking process and the epiphany that Andy had, because they didn't have the structure and the processes within the company to get there. There were so many loyalties to the incumbency, so to speak. Like this is how things are. We need to stay the same. And so you can picture salespeople being attached to, well, if I don't have memory chips to sell, then I can't make my commissions. And maybe their bosses and people on the factory floor, same thing. Like if we give this up, then what are we going to sell? How am I going to have a job and a paycheck? So not just salespeople and factory workers, but their bosses and their bosses. So this was a cool thing for Intel and Andy Grove, and so I mean his book, I'm sure it's inspired a lot of people in Silicon Valley to be able to think, outside the boardroom, and what would you do if you were an outsider to improve a company. Let me just finish this one paragraph here from the Heath brothers. After much gnashing of teeth, Grove insisted that the sales force tell their customers that Intel would no longer be carrying memory products. The customer's reaction was, essentially, a big yawn. One customer said, it sure took you a long time. So even the customers knew that Intel should be doing something different. Since that decision in 1985, Intel has dominated the microprocessor market. Obviously, just continuing to innovate and making your PC faster and faster and able to, more power. And even though they still have the model of the core processor, which, everything, your CPU, everything has to go through that. So if you've got, sometimes I have 15 internet windows open and 6 programs, when I'm doing research. And once in a while at my network here at Zach's, I might get, that might slow me down a bit, but generally not, because we have such, strong network computing power, and the box underneath my desk has got the fastest Intel core processors. You couldn't do that 10 years ago. Anyway, I just want to finish this about what's happened to Intel since then. Now, this book is like 2012, 2013. So they've got, they're looking back after, 25 years on this decision. If on the day of Andy Grove's insight, you had invested $1,000 in Intel, by 2012, your investment would have been worth $47,000 compared with $7,600 for the S&P. So look at that compounding, what Intel did from 85. Obviously, we went through the tech bubble in 99, but and you're doing much better than that lately when Intel just made new highs again above 55. So they conclude, it seems safe to say that he made the right decision. But what they go into the book is how did he get there, and what could corporations do differently to have better processes for making those decisions. All right. Let me just see what we're doing here for time, because I said this is going to be a 3-episode podcast. So I'm already at 40 minutes, Danny. Okay, yeah. So I better wrap this up. And I know I wanted to close with something juicy here, but we're going to talk about Clayton Christensen, because he just passed away January 23rd, and Clayton Christensen was sort of he wrote a book in the mid-90s called The Innovator's Dilemma. And then he became fascinated and obsessed with innovation and disruption. And so he chronicled, a lot of the successes and failures of companies in the past 20 years. I talked about him in my last episode, I think, where he gave the example of how he was advising somebody about the disk drive companies, and that everything seemed fine with the disk drive companies, but when he in terms of the data, but when he actually went out and visited them and talked to the companies and their customers, he saw the problems that they were going to have in their business. And so it took looking past the data in a spreadsheet and actually, meeting companies and going on the factory floor. And the reason we're going to talk about Clayton again, there's a lot to talk about in his work to begin with, but he also, I Googled execution. What should we be paying attention to from companies that execute well? And when I did that, I found this book that I didn't know exists called The 4 Disciplines of Execution. And it's a really exciting book, and one of the authors knew Clayton Christensen, and Clayton Christensen knew Andy Grove. So a lot of brilliant minds were connected here. So we'll be talking about this book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution, and get some good stuff out of that. All right, let me go back to my notes here and see. I wanted to close on something really good. Did you know that I had forgotten this, that the Bell Company in 1879 or something had the chance. Oh no, it was Western Union. Western Union had the chance to buy Alexander Graham Bell's patent on his new invention. Western Union, they're sending telegrams, with clicks and whatnot, and they called his new invention of the telephone, or whatever it was called at that time, 1880. They called it an electric toy or an electronic toy, something like that. And they passed on buying the patent. That was a bad decision, I think. Another modern example would be Kodak. Kodak actually invented digital photography. They did. In their labs, they invented digital photography, and they buried it. They thought it wasn't going to be anything. They didn't want any part of it. They didn't want it to disrupt their existing business in photography and print film. Maybe that's where they made all their money, was on the film for printing. And so they ignored the technology that they invented that has since become a mega business and is changing the world in many ways. All right. Looking over my list here. I know I had something I wanted to close with that was really exciting, and I just can't think of it now. I got to mention a few companies. So I mentioned, I want to talk, Elon Musk and Tesla. We're going to talk more about Musk because I found this interview, and I have to look it up again, with a former Tesla employee, I believe. Maybe he's still there. And he was either a product manager or an engineer. Not sure which. I think he leaned toward engineer, because in this interview, he said what has been great about working with Elon, or Elon, I guess is the right pronunciation for his name, is that he quickly got down to first principles. In other words, if you were talking about design or engineering, he wanted to just break it down. Like, what problem are we trying to solve? What is the pure essence of this? And he would break everything down to first principles. And the guy who was talking about Elon, he said, I was going for first principles, and Elon would take me down further. Like, let's really get to the core of this. So that's kind of a cool thing to hear. And I don't know a ton about Musk, but it seems like things are really working for him. And I'm not just talking about the price of the stock going to 900. I'm talking about the cars are popular, the quality is there, the sales are there. He's able to meet production goals, and so those kinds of things are working. And then his space company, I've talked about that before. Obviously the space company, SpaceX, is working because they were able to do this test with NASA in late January with an unmanned crew capsule, the Dragon. They tested an abort. What would happen if we had to abort right after liftoff? And about 90 seconds into liftoff on the Falcon 9 rocket, the Dragon crew capsule escapes away and then lands safely in the ocean. And that was a key test. And when I saw that, I was just like amazed at the progress he's made there with NASA. And NASA was, they were partners in it. And so to me, I said at the time, this guy obviously surrounds himself with the best engineering talent that he can find, and you would think more people would want to work for him. All right, Richard Branson. Why did I want to talk about Branson again? Well, just because he's sort of he's a leader who he's created all these different businesses, and I know this is the key thing about him. And you want to talk about leadership and execution. This guy is, I got to find a book about him and really understand this, because let's say he has 25 successful businesses. I know it's more than that, but his philosophy is to find the right person to run that business and then let them go, and don't hover over them, don't bug them, don't find good people who are passionate and motivated and talented and creative, and let them run that business, and good things happen. So that's a style of leadership which for him leads to all kinds of good things with strategy and execution. We're going to talk about Larry Page from Google. One of my favorite quotes of his a few years ago, as he evolved as a visionary CEO and a philosopher king, I would call him. He said one of the most important questions he found himself asking lately was, is what you are working on capable of changing the world? And he found that he only wanted to work on things that were that important. And they have so many different projects going. You can see that a lot of people there feel the same way. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up now. And the one word I've sort of left out of this is culture. That every corporation develops its own culture, which is often a derivative of the leader, whether that person is charismatic or not, male or female, doesn't matter. But the culture of leadership, like a Richard Branson, then from that you get you get decision making and execution, whether you like it or not. It's impacted by the culture. Okay, and we're going to talk about Diamandis too. I'll end there since we've talked about all the rocket guys, Musk, Bezos, Branson, and Page has a space project too. The guy that knows them all and got them, all together and has written books about them is Peter Diamandis, because he invented the X Prize, which, was 2004, and it was $10 million. The Ansari X Prize, $10 million to the first company that could have 2 successful rocket launches in the space of 2 weeks, a private company. And Burt Rutan of Scaled Composites, who I've talked about here, he won that, and Richard Branson then immediately partnered with him and put the capital into Scale Composites to build what Branson has now with Spaceship 2 and White Knight 2. White Knight is the big bird that the Rutan developed, engineered to take Branson's spaceship to the upper atmosphere, like 50,000 feet, drop it and let it go. All right, so we'll talk about Diamandis because he has a new book with Stephen Kotler. The future is faster than you think, or something like that. And that's been a constant theme here on the Mind Over Money podcast, is that the future is coming at us really fast, and we need to prepare for it. So stick with the Mind Over Money podcast. Make sure you share it. Find us on iTunes, SoundCloud. Share it. Leave comments. And you can also find an article version. Every time I do a podcast, I don't do a precise transcript, but what I do is I do an article version where I give, the links, the names of the books, the people, some stories, the stocks I talked about. And so that's always good. And you can find, so if you go to ZACKS, that's, I work for the Lenzax, and that's his name, ZACKS. Zax.com/podcasts, and then look for the Mind Over Money podcast, and you'll find an archive of everything I've done here. All right, I will see you next week, and we'll continue part 2 of Fast Times at Innovation High.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.